All right, let's kick things off. Thank you to everybody who's joining us online. Welcome to XY Sensors webinar, everything you need to know about deploying sensors in your workplace. My name is Libby and I will be your host for today's session. Now, today we're going to be exploring what's really involved in deploying occupancy sensors across a workplace. As you can see, we're joined by XY Sensors Head of Customer Success, Shivaun Ryan. Hi, Shivaun.
Hi, Libby.
Shivaun's going to be walking us through a 5-step process for sensor installation and also share some common mistakes to avoid when planning your own sensor implementation. Now, this is a webinar we've gotten a lot of requests for, right, Shivaun? There's a ton of people researching new tools and technologies like sensors to support their transition back into the office and to take a more data-driven approach to occupancy and space planning. But they're workplace professionals and they may have never been involved in installing this type of sensor hardware in their offices or really thinking about workplace analytics in a programmatic way.
Yeah, absolutely, Libby. So sensors like XY Sense are relatively new technology. And because you've got a hardware component, so a sensor physically needs to be installed in an office to start collecting data. It's a little bit more complicated than just a username and a password. But that's all right. That's what we're here for to run through today. So we're going to lay out everything that's involved. So if you're considering sensors as part of your workplace strategy, you know what to expect and how to make the whole implementation process as simple and as streamlined as possible for you, your facilities team, and the broader team that's utilizing the space. It's worth noting that everything we talk about today is broadly applicable to any type of workplace occupancy sensor you might be evaluating. So while we're speaking from the perspective of XY Sense and our clients' experiences, there's lots of good takeaways for all workplace and facility teams.
Great, thanks, Shivaun. Well, before we get started, it is worth noting for everybody who's joining us that we will be having a dedicated Q&A portion at the end of today's presentation. So as we're moving through the content, if you have a question, just navigate to the Q&A tab at the bottom of the Zoom screen that you can see, and you can enter a question in there and we'll be able to answer that when we get to the end. Also, if anything pops up, my little head might jump up and interrupt Shivaun if it's particularly poignant, and we should address that straight away. All right, let's jump in. Shivaun, over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Libby. So we like to start with, when we are talking about a deployment, of firstly defining the analytics requirements. So the analytics is the output and the end result of doing a deployment. So we like to start here and then work backwards, and that does provide a good framework for doing a sensor deployment strategy. So if you're not 100% sure about the types of data and reports different stakeholders need, or how far you'd like to extend different use cases into the future, you can end up deploying sensors incorrectly, or worse still, installing the wrong type of sensor for your longer term needs. So you should start planning your journey around your workplace strategy and your business goals. So are you in a high growth environment where you're welcoming not lots of new team members into the office environment and you're always considering leasing new space to try and keep up? Or are you in an established space with an established team and you're really focusing on getting people back into the office and understanding how the new hybrid dynamics could change your fit out requirements? So the data that you need to optimize your portfolio for cost savings is a little different from the data you need to collect if you're identifying friction and congestion points in the office. So it's quite important to have your workplace strategy objectives understood and documented so you can more easily map the different types of data and insights that you need to collect in order to support those goals. So having mapped out your workplace strategy objectives, it's time to check in on where you're currently at with your utilizing workspace data and analytics in your workplace decisioning. So at XY Sense, we often talk about this idea of the workplace data maturity curve, with companies generally adhering to particular profiles. So you can see from this lovely graph, don't get too overwhelmed by reading this. We will be sharing the content with you guys afterwards, but there seems to be different levels of where people sit in this curve. So there are beginners, So users that don't have consistent workplace data capturing methods in place, they may be able to manually extract building access data or conduct a one-off survey with people using the space, but consistent benchmarking over time or any meaningful integration of workplace analytics into space and real estate decisioning is just the beginning. Right through to the actualizers who have advanced workplace technology stacks and typically a fully integrated employee workplace application experience. Real-time workplace occupancy data is often made available to users of the space to simplify booking a desk or a room or to support live wayfinding. At this level, data-driven workplace insights are ingrained in space decisioning and occupancy planning and also made more accessible across the business. Now, you might fit into the beginner profile, you might be somewhere in the middle, or you might already be quite advanced, but it's worth getting your team together to audit and evaluate your current capabilities in the workplace analytics so you can build a plan for what's next. So we suggest kind of taking a three-stage approach with this. So it doesn't need to be very long or an exhaustive process, but first things first, conduct an audit. Like, where are you guys at right now? So what data sources have you currently got available? Is it high quality data? And how much wrangling does it require to access this? Would you describe the governance systems or processes that you have in place for workplace data? And how difficult is it to access this data and actually build a recommendation from it? Next, we'd suggest holding a workshop. So always a really good way to gather insights and requirements. So has your workplace strategy changed with the pandemic? And are you now considering downsizing or moving to activity-based working instead of a fixed desk scenario to accommodate a hybrid work environment? So we'd suggest that you map out every single way you intend to use workplace occupancy or utilization data, from creating weekly attendance or floor utilization reports to integrating live office data with space booking tools, and then order them in terms of priority of what will be most beneficial for your business. Finally, and the last step of this is to perform a gap analysis between what your current capabilities are and what your desired outcomes are. This will help you document the type of data that you need to collect and therefore what requirements you actually have for a workplace sensor. It's also very worthwhile remembering that a lot of hardware is very different, and some hardware works harder than others when it comes to workplace analytics and use cases. So you can collect badge data from a building, which might help tell you how many people attended the office on a given day, but it can't tell you how many desks or meeting rooms were in use or what the dwell times are in popular spaces. We can use under-desk PIR pucks that might tell you when a desk is in use, but it can't tell you the dwell times at soft seating areas or in social zones like cafeterias. There's one of the clear benefits of an advanced area sensor like XY Sense, because it can capture positional coordinates across a wide area, so up to 1,000 square foot or around 20 desks in real time. So this means that the sensor supports incredibly rich data capture for superior analytics and a greater variety of use cases for this data across a complete space. So one of the key things for a successful implementation comes to coverage. So understanding what your business cases are from doing your different workshops will actually help give us insight into where you need coverage for your sensor technologies. So this is a key part of your requirements gathering for a particular deployment. So you want to start considering, do you want to include every size meeting room? Sometimes you won't want a single office. Do we want private offices? Do we want kitchen areas? Or maybe just desks and work points? So again, aligning that back to what the business requirements are and what some of the pain points would be. As a general rule, the more coverage that you desire, the more sensors you will need. Obviously, the exception can be XY Sense, given we are a wide coverage solution. So when it comes to working out coverage as well, there's a lot of things that you can work with your vendor with, or a partner if you're working with a partner, to assist in actually coming up with a correct coverage plan. So there's a number of assets that you can provide during this planning stage to ensure that the space is completely understood. And this will allow for an effective plan for coverage of the areas that you require. So a standard floor plan is usually 2-dimensional, which gives us a good grasp of the layout, and it's usually a very good starting point, but there is a lot of additional information that's just not included. So there's a few other things we recommend providing if you have access to them. So something like a reflected ceiling plan can actually tell us where we have the availability in the ceiling space to install a sensor that's not going to conflict with a lighting fixture or maybe an air conditioning duct that's exposed, that we can make recommendations around that. We're also finding a lot of designers and interior fit out companies are liking to hang, for aesthetic purposes, a lot of different things from the ceiling to make a design look cool. Seeing things like saucepans, plants are becoming very popular, and they just don't seem to appear, especially plants, on a plan anywhere. So we do suggest that we do get provided, if there's anything unusual in terms of the fit out that's going in that might actually obstruct a sensor, that we do get notified, because there's ways we can work around that. We're finding a lot more of the kind of cave style desking that has an overhead for privacy, which will impact some of the line of sight visibility. So we can work around that if we know about it. And then whenever you're in doubt, photos are always a great way for us to understand some of the furniture and the layout of a space to be able to plan effectively around that. And also, when we're talking about coverage areas, it is sometimes easier to work out what you don't want included rather than what you do, because we do find that usually it's a smaller list, and for consistency across installations, that will be important, which we'll talk about slightly later. So now that you've defined your strategy and gathered most of your requirements, it's time to procure your sensors. So just to note, it is quite common for us to do an RFP or to run a pilot across one floor or one location for a customer. So stage 2, so building your deployment plan. So part 1 of this, we'd always suggest getting the team together. So from running your workshops, you should know who your key internal stakeholders are for a sensor deployment. So we'd suggest getting them together once decisions have been made, just to get explaining the outcomes and the objectives of the deployment, so everyone's in line with what's coming. So a project kickoff as well with the vendor is always a good idea. So any of the team members can ask any questions that they have at the start and conception of a project. With the team, then we'd suggest that you get together and prepare the key milestones and activities for the project. So it's important that everyone knows what they're contributing to the project, and also to get that buy-in. So once it comes to the site going live, the people are actually aware of what's going on. It's also not uncommon for some deployments, especially if it's a new build, will actually go on for quite a long period of time. So we want to make sure that once we actually get to the site live, the people are aware of the process and kind of what needs to happen at what stages, because once we get to actually move-in date, things start to happen quite quickly. So it is good for everyone to know the key milestones and pivot points in the deployment. But lucky for you all, and part of this webinar, we've actually done a template sensor deployment planning project for you guys. So that's going to get emailed to you all after this session. So that's obviously the focus is predominantly XY, but it's also beneficial regardless of whatever sensor technology you might be using for deployment. So then we get to installing the sensors. So this is the fun part. So we like to break the deployment just into 5 simple stages. So there's obviously a lot more to consider apart from just the sensor being installed. So there's also the hubs, which act as a connectivity source, and there's also some cabling that is required for an XY Sense in particular installation. So we'll usually conduct a site walkthrough in collaboration with the client and an installation partner. And this helps us verify that nothing's been missed in the plans, that we can install sensors at every expected location, and there's just nothing that we weren't expecting to happen. Also good for the installer to just do a brief and introduction to any site contacts that they do need for inductions. The next stage is to run all the cabling. And if we do require to install power outlets for the hubs, that would get installed at this point as well. Then the hardware gets fitted off, so that would be compromising our sensors and our hubs. The next stage is to commission. So the commissioning of the sensors just allows us to fine tune the positioning for the sensors to pick up the sightings of the area that we require. So just good to note that that is done through our web portal. Then we map all the spaces that would have been provided to us by the client as the scope areas of what they want included. So this is quite an important part of the process, and it's something we mostly manage internally at XY. So what we will do is we will actually geofence all of the work points, all of the meeting rooms, all of the collaboration areas, and that's what actually gives the data to the analytics. So it is quite an important piece of the process. That can all be changed as the site might change, but we'll go through that shortly. Then once the installation is complete, we activate the sensors, and then the fun starts happening that we start collecting some data. So we'll just go through an overview of XY installation in terms of hardware. So you'll see this image, we've got three floors. The first thing to note is that none of the floors are connected in terms of cabling. So each floor does run independently. So the main thing each floor needs to have is a primary hub. So a primary hub is what you can see with the antennas of the image on the left. So the primary hub actually gives data to each sensor and additional hub that's on that floor. So that's a cellular connection. So we're not actually interfering with any of the corporate networks. So from that primary hub, we can connect in a daisy chain configuration up to 6 sensors in a chain. So that allows us to not have to run cabling from each sensor back to a central location, that we can actually piggyback off the sensor before it. So each hub has 4 outputs that we can use, and each of those 4 outputs can have up to 6 sensors on the chain. So it does allow us a lot of flexibility in terms of an installation and where we can run cables from. So each particular hub can take 24 sensors. And then as we have levels that require more than 24 sensors, we can simply add a secondary hub, and the secondary hub just gets connected back to the primary hub for data, and then that data can actually flow through to any of the additional sensors that are connected to it. So then just to talk a bit more about SenseLink. So SenseLink is the proprietary technology that allows multiple sensors to be daisy chained together during an installation. So it allows the cabling to draw power and data from a single source, being our hub. So as I mentioned before, each SenseLink can have up to 6 sensors in a chain. There's also a maximal cable length, which is 150 meters from the hub to sensor number 6 in that chain. Obviously, we don't have to have 6 sensors in the chain. It can be any configuration up to 6. And as I also said earlier, there is 4 outputs available on each communications hub. So having this configuration does give us a lot of flexibility of where we can install hubs, where we run cables. So it is very beneficial for an installation. We do have a little kind of cheat table that we use when we are defining how many hubs we require. So this table does give us a maximum number of sensors that we can have in any configuration, and what configuration of hubs we use for each floor, which is quite beneficial. Usually we would always recommend never to maximize out a hub and just leave some space for if any additional sensors need to be added afterwards. So for example, a layout of a floor changes and we now require extra coverage, having additional outputs from one of the other sensors that we can daisy chain from will actually allow us that flexibility if we do need to add in any additional coverage later. And then on the topic of cabling, it often comes up comparing cables to battery-powered sensors. So each have their application, but for a real-time sustainable solution with minimum maintenance, a cabling solution is always going to be preferred. So battery-powered sensors are often marketed as being simpler for installation, but they typically rely on non-rechargeable batteries and create a significant amount of waste and logistical cost for scheduling replacements. So for an XY deployment, because we get to leverage SenseLink, we typically require 80% less cabling versus a traditional PoE system. So that is quite a significant difference when it comes to labor costs for running cables, but also the ease of an installation. So the next step is space mapping, which I spoke about before. So space mapping, as I said, so this is where the data starts from. So you'll see in this graphic that we've got just a simple floor plan. You can see all of the work points that are mapped on this. So we simply go in and draw a geofence square. We can do very different type shapes and things like that, depending on the workplace that we've got. And that will define the space type. So you'll see here on the left, so this is just a screenshot from our web portal. So we've got all the different space types that are available. So work point, meeting room, office, depending on the space type we're using, we can actually add in custom space types, but these are the most common ones that we have. So this is the baseline of what informs our analytics. So then the next layer above that is groups. So we can assign any of our space types to different groups. So depending on your particular workplace scenario, you might have your group set up as neighborhoods, you might have your group set up as departments, as is the case here. So all completely customizable. You'll also notice there's no group. So desks don't have to get, or workspaces don't have to get assigned to particular groups. But as much data as we can add will inform and actually make our analytics way more insightful. So we always recommend that we add in as much of this data and information that's available, as it makes the analytics much easier to read and understand. There's also additional information we can add for spaces. So you'll see in this little screenshot, this is the configuration for a space. So we can name every space, every work point. Again, it's much easier to read the analytics when it's a logical name. If you've got a particular naming convention you're using in the business, we can apply that. So it makes reading the reports much simpler. We can also add capacities. So where we've got meeting rooms, very topical at the moment with COVID restrictions, that a lot of meeting rooms are set with certain capacities. So we can set in the new capacities and obviously change these as guidelines and regulations change with capacities for spaces. That's going to give us certain insights, like if we've got a capacity room for 4, we can run reporting to see how many times are we actually going over that capacity in a particular space, which does, there's a lot of different use cases, so it does get quite interesting being able to add some additional information to any of the spaces. We also can do a date active. So speaking about COVID regulations, there is quite a lot of change that's happening of desks being used, desks not being used. So any changes we make, we almost have this time machine mechanism that allows us to backdate or put an applicable date from being active for that change, which will actually which won't actually change the analytics for anything prior to that change as well. So all the data actually remains constant and consistent. So once all the configuration has been completed, data will start to get captured. And then you'll start seeing dashboards. And one of the most common questions we usually get asked is how we actually calculate occupancy. So we actually do this using different thresholds, and all of these are completely customizable based on a client's needs. So as an example, as a standard, we say a work point's utilized if it's cumulatively used for more than 60 minutes in a day. But this can be changed based on your business rules and configurations. And as another metric, what we use as default for working hours is between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. from Monday to Friday. And as we go through the onboarding, if these need to be altered or there are specific working business rules that you have, we can apply those, as obviously everything does affect the analytics. So then the site goes live. So now that you've got your sensors installed and your workplace team is eager to start collecting data, but there's a really important step to take before you activate your sensors, and that's to notify your employees and the people who'll be using the space about the sensors. So at XY, we believe that customers should follow world's best practices around disclosure of data capture in the workplace. It's critical that you understand the privacy and workplace legislation which could apply for use of sensors in your workplace. So at XY, we know the property teams want to use office utilization data to create awesome workplace experiences and not to evade people's privacy. We're called XY Sense because our advanced sensors leverage the latest developments in machine learning to capture and process the X and Y coordinates of people relative to a sensor in real time. There's no way to identify individuals from XY Sense data. So unlike badge swipes or under-desk PIR device agents, XY Sense captures data passively about the space, never an individual. And with processing occurring at each individual sensor, we've engineered our solution so that images are never sent, stored, or retrieved. Only 100% anonymous and fully encrypted occupancy data is made available via our secure analytics platform for workplace reporting and display applications. So different solutions may have different privacy implications for people in your workplace. So selecting a solution that's private by design is always a safer bet. So assuming you've selected a solution with an appropriate privacy control, the next step is to pull together a communications plan for your team. So we generally see our workplace teams pair up with their human resources department at this point. So where data collection is completely anonymous and there's no way to identify individuals, it's a relatively simple to pull together an email or intranet notification for your team and a resources pack. Such a notification generally includes information about how the sensors work, the type of data the sensors will be collecting, how individual privacy is being protected. It's also good to include the benefits in collecting this data. So pretty much what you're going to be using the data for and where they can go if they've got any questions. So being transparent and explaining how the sensor data will be used to improve their workplace experience can increase their buy-in to the workplace analytics strategy and make it simpler to explain why a particular space decision has been made in the future. As a sensor partner, we're obviously happy to provide explanation, collateral, and information which can assist you at this stage. Some customers also choose to put up signage in specific areas about the sensors being used, but that's completely up to you. Then our sensors go live. So just so everyone knows what's going on, and then we actually explain to the people what these things are in the ceiling, and everyone gets a communication that our site is now live. Then we wait for our analytics to populate. So obviously from day one, we're not going to have an amazing amount of insights. So what we usually suggest that we do is we let the data actually gather for up to a week before we start doing any training on the system. So as usually is the case with data, the more data we collect, the more valuable it will become and the richer insights we can gather from it. We do also have clients that want to display a simple version of the data to all the users of the workplace. So we can capture data in this form of a live display that's actually going to show availability for that particular floor that they're on. So imagine the amount of hires over the pandemic that have never been into an office space before. So this application would be generally very helpful for them to come in and actually understand how the space is used and also what frequency of availability is there for specific regions and a quick way of wayfinding. So then once we've got everything set up and configured to the client's requirements, we usually suggest that we let as I mentioned, let the analytics run for about a week, because it's always more intuitive for a client to go through their own data where they know the space more intimately, and it is a much more beneficial training session rather than we could go through some generic data, but when it doesn't mean anything and we've got meeting names labeled to actually the client's workplace, it does become a much better training session. So we'll do a full run through of the analytics and the dashboards based on the client's use cases, which they'll come to us from their workshops because they will have a good understanding of what they do require. We also set up automated reporting for most of our clients. Again, this doesn't need to happen, but we do find it's a very good way to start to get people to digest some of the data that we are collecting. So we'll usually set up just a portfolio level or a site level report that goes out weekly, usually on a Monday morning, that gives a very high level snapshot of what's happened the week before in that particular building or for that particular company across their real estate portfolio. So we find that what we do is we can customize these reports based again on the use cases, but we'll usually start with a pretty basic one that's generic, that gives the most kind of the best insights for a weekly report as to what's going on in the building. Again, we can configure these and the frequency of them and the graphs that do get included. Always a really good thing that some of our clients love to send to the executive to show them, again, what's happening in their workplace with a lot of level of detail, but also not requiring them to actually log into the platform. So a quick recap. So just to go through, obviously the technology is quite new. And when you're considering putting in technology like this, it's always good to get feedback from others' experiences. So we have gathered just some 3 key points of insights that we have found from some of our customers. So things that they wish they knew before they started putting in sensor technology. So defining the scope areas. Something that obviously planning in the initial stages, it can be quite beneficial to then extrapolate that out as maybe a rollout goes global or it goes national across different spaces. So we do have a lot of clients that once they do one site, they actually want to gather and compare the insights that they're getting from one particular building across either a national portfolio, sometimes a global portfolio. So having consistent scope areas across all of these sites does actually really help the analytics for comparisons. So putting that time in of thinking for future proofing as well of what might happen in the office space, how might it change, and becoming really clear on either those scope areas or those areas we definitely don't want to include in analytics really does help us with a full deployment overview for multi-sites. Then the planning stage. So we've spoken earlier about the auditing and the workshops. So spending a lot of time at that from the start will really help you align your sensor strategy with your CRE initiatives. So having that alignment there is obviously very beneficial. And also getting the greater team involved earlier. So at XY, we don't charge per user. So we want to get as many people in the organization to have access to this data if it's valuable for them. So trying to work out, again, at those early stages of workshops of, okay, what data is required? Who will that data be beneficial for to actually have access to will really help getting these people involved and getting that buy-in at an early stage that this is really going to help them make decisions, make their job easier and get some of the outcomes that they're looking to achieve. So as a summary, there's obviously a lot we've gone through there. So ensuring that we've got success with our sensors. So obviously we've created a deployment plan for you that you'll get access to after this webinar. So we'd suggest using this. So there's obviously in a sensor deployment, there's a lot of stakeholders. There's a physical installation that's happening. We need to make sure that everyone's aligned, but also aligned to the outcome. So we need to get everyone involved. So a clear project plan with clear responsibilities, as is the case with any project, is always beneficial to put that time in at the start so everyone knows what their responsibilities are within the project. So I've said earlier, the deployment process can be quite long from conception of ideation of putting sensors into a workplace to actually getting the installation done, to actually having move-in dates. So we are seeing a lot of fluctuation with timelines given return to offices around the world are changing weekly. So it is important to make sure that people know what are the key milestones through the project. The second point is ensure that the power users are brought into the process earlier. So I mentioned earlier, getting people involved in the workshop so they know the type of outcomes across the whole strategy for workplace is important. And then for them to know where the sensor technology fits into that is always important for that ongoing use of this data and analytics which we're gathering. Obviously, our sensors are getting data capturing every 2 seconds. So there is quite a lot of data being captured. And then, as we've spoke about a lot, is using the workshops to actually understand what data your business needs to actually make friction points less or to align to whatever your strategy is. Once you know your requirements, as I said, we're capturing data every 2 seconds. So if you've got examples of reporting that you want, we can manipulate the data to get the report that you want if we don't already have a dashboard on that. Obviously, we've got a very thorough list of dashboards and analytic reporting that we've got built into the system. But if you're unsure how to generate the particular outcome that you want, we obviously assist with that in the onboarding process. But to actually define your requirements very clearly will massively assist you throughout the life cycle of using your sensor technology to get the outcomes that you want. So with that, that was obviously a lot of information and a lot of me talking. So it'd be lovely to jump to if we've got any Q&A from the deployment, any of the content that I've run through. So Libby, have we got anything coming through?
Yeah, first of all, thanks so much, Shivaun. That was really helpful and great to see it kind of laid out step by step, you know, the different considerations that people need to have. And I think we can definitely see the link between planning at one stage and ROI at the other end in terms of the analytics output that they're going to get. So thanks for the comprehensive presentation. On to questions. So let's take a look. If you do have a question for Shivaun, feel free to chuck it into the Q&A, and I'm just going to kind of pull them up now. So first up, Shivaun, who typically does the install? Is it an internal team or an external partner that does these?
So it's typically an external partners. So we work globally with a few installation partners that we've trained up individually to get them to the standard that we need. Obviously, it is quite a simple installation, but it's like with every installation, to get the output, it is the quality of the installation. That is very important. Mm-hmm. So we sometimes do work with the clients if they've got a team already that they're working with that are doing similar like data installations, but there is a kind of a minimum requirement of a partner that we'd want to work with. So we're obviously open to working with some of our clients selected suppliers, but we would want to be involved obviously in the training to make sure we're getting that quality through.
Okay, that makes sense. And you know, the $1 million question, or rather not $1 million question, but how much does a typical installation cost?
I was like, I could kind of see where this question was going, but starting it with $1 million is not, fortunately, is not the cost. So obviously it's kind of how long is a piece of string. So a typical installation will obviously depend on the environment. So we'll usually see either a new build or an existing building. Obviously, doing an installation in an existing building usually would require an installation to happen after hours if the building's occupied. That usually comes with higher labor rates, as I'm sure most people are across. Again, the number of sensors that we're installing and kind of what's inhibiting any cable runs, etc. But we do find, obviously, the more sensors that we get, economies of scale come in, but we kind of average it out of kind of $280. That's a very basic start point that you could be looking at per sensor, but obviously varied on a lot of other things.
Yeah, obviously, if we're looking at installing in the UK versus the US versus Singapore, different partners, different environments, those kinds of things. But I think it's worth noting that, you know, if you are considering a sensor installation in your particular region, we're definitely able to provide a more kind of customized, targeted quote for you, and that information can be kind of provided through that process.
Definitely.
Cool. Okay, next question. Can you confirm if the data gathered through sensors can feed into existing space management systems?
Yeah, so we do have a full API available. So there's a number of partners that we already work with, but our engineering team are open to working with different partners. So again, something we can scope out in an initial discussion if there are particular platforms that you want to integrate with. We've done a lot of them. So because our data is kind of the source of truth for occupancy, we feed into their system. So most of the time, the work is actually on the technology partner side. But again, requirements and scoping and planning, but happy to have all those conversations if there is particular technology companies.
Great. And another question, just a question about the level of detail that the sensors can capture. So this person asks, can it identify whether a person's sitting and standing? Can it identify whether somebody's on, say, a phone?
At the moment, not yet. Obviously, there's so many different features of what we can be tracking, having the base level of tracking occupancy, but all these things are definitely on our roadmap to be able to provide even richer insights as to how people are using a space.
Great. So at the moment, it's mostly position on a floor plan, and we can position somebody to within 1 foot or 30 centimeters every 2 seconds. So that does give you a ton of information across a whole area. So you can kind of see teams working at couches or kitchen areas, whether they're at desks, stand-up desks, everything like that. So it's full area coverage, but that level of kind of sit-stand differentiation is still in our labs.
Yeah. And also what we find very interesting is the time of day tracking of what times of the day we're finding most people in spaces or at work points or just generally across an office space. So that gives another level of data as well.
Yeah, it's really interesting, I guess, with everybody transitioning back into a new mode of work with hybrid work, coming in, maybe working a little bit differently than they were working before. And that has really massive implications for longer term space planning and lease strategies and things like that. So
definitely seen insights of any offices that are occupied coming in later, leaving earlier. So it is going to be quite interesting tracking all of these different changes.
Awesome. Great. So one more, a question about installers. So is it possible for installers to have access to the positioning data views that show which sensor is picking up a person and what the confidence level is? This would help with the calibration and dealing with hanging plants and overlapped sensor situation. So this sounds like it's coming from one of our partners who's looking for a new feature when it does come to positioning sensors.
Interesting. So it's a very specific question.
Yes.
So we do have the ability in our back end, and it's something we're using for some of the new features we're coming for improvements for our algorithms, which is seeing that confidence rating. At the moment, it's an internal XY admin feature that we can actually see the rate of confidence, do some minor tweaking. It's not ready yet to open up to all the installer base because we're doing a lot more work to make sure that it's perfect before it gets released. But yes, definitely something. There's a lot of things we're considering and coming soon to help installers do a better job.
Great, fantastic. Okay, and one final question, just looking at time. So if we are tracking people anonymously, how would we track a person and their group in an agile environment if desks are not allocated to a specific group?
Yeah, so it is one of the things, obviously, having anonymous data is we don't want to track specific people. There are a few use cases, obviously, coming in more agile environments that we are exploring in our labs to see how we can do that while maintaining the balance of privacy, which is obviously a major factor for businesses. So what we would do is would be able to get a lot of different insights on how many people are using a space. So if you've got project spaces and breakout spaces, you'd obviously need to get insights of how many people are those spaces occupying and how many people do you need, and how many spaces do you need to allocate for. So we can run different analytics to say, okay, you maybe have breakout spaces for groups of 3, but you've actually got demand for groups of 8. So how can you best accommodate those groups of 8 people? So we've got a lot of this predictive utilization through our platform that's actually going to give you those insights without needing to go into the level of using specific data of teams.
Okay, great. Well, I think that is all that we've got time for at the moment. Thank you, Shivaun, for your fantastic presentation. So what happens now for everybody who maybe has watched today's presentation, is thinking about deploying sensors, or maybe you're a little bit further along and you're considering different vendors or how it could work? Well, essentially what we're going to do is we're going to share today's the recording of today's presentation. Feel free to share this with any colleagues who may be involved in your own occupancy sensor planning process. We're also going to be sharing that handy project planning spreadsheet that Shivaun mentioned earlier. And that spreadsheet actually lays out every milestone we discussed today in sequential order with who's responsible, whether that's you, the vendor that you select, or somebody else in your team. And we're also providing indicative timelines for each milestone. So we hope that spreadsheet is useful in your planning. You can take it, you can manipulate it, but it does give you a good sense of what to do when, so that you can make sure that your planning's ready to go. Finally, as always, do feel free to reach out to us directly if you've got any more questions, or if you'd like to organize an XY Sense demo to learn a little bit more about our own sensor solution and our analytics and how they could support you in your workplace strategy. So everybody that's registered, stay tuned for that email. It will be with you very shortly after today. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody who's joined us today, and specifically Shivaun, I'd like to thank you for taking us through all of that great content.
No problem.
Great. All right, with that, I guess we'll say farewell to everybody who's joined us. And until our next webinar, happy space planning.
Excellent. Thanks, Libby.
Bye, guys.
XY Sense is a new kind of workplace sensor to help you better plan and use space in your workplace.